The stately three-story home known as Rotherwood Mansion sits high atop a hill, overlooking the Holston River in Kingsport, Tennessee. The red brick building is lined with 30-foot columns in the front, and it gives visitors a wonderful view of the river and land beyond it. What else does it give us? Well, today, it gives us a 2-for-1 deal in the ghost story department. 2 ghosts at the bare minimum. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. In the early 1800s, Frederick Ross and his family inherited a large plot of land, several thousand acres to be exact, along the north and south forks of the Holston River in eastern Tennessee. The land ran from Bays Mountain nearly all the way to the Virginia border. Pleased with the newly acquired land, work was set into motion for a new home. The northern third of the house was completed in 1818. The southern third was completed in 1820. Then the two were joined together in what we now know as the mansion in 1845. The home got its name from Sir Walter Scott's 1819 novel Ivanhoe. Mr. Ross was such a fan of the book, it seems, that he had a daughter named after one of the main characters as well. Rowena Ross was considered one of, if not the most beautiful woman in the area. It's said her fair complexion and raven black hair caught the eyes of many a male suitor, but in Rowena's eyes there was only one man she was interested in. Her father Frederick was beyond happy with his daughter's choice of a man, and immediately had work begin on a new home across the river for his daughter and soon-to-be family. The house was set to be an exact duplicate of Rotherwood Mansion, the only difference being white brick rather than red. Unfortunately, it would never be lived in as it suffered from fire shortly after its completion. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was an omen. Regardless, the Ross family tried to put the disaster behind them and continue on with the wedding plans anyway. On the day of the wedding, the families of the bride and groom gathered early to enjoy each other's company. The groom and several of his friends decided to try their hand at fishing before the start of the ceremony, no doubt throwing jokes that he'd better do it now before marriage took away any time to do it afterwards. They took out a boat onto the Holston River, but stayed within view of the families gathered at the home. Rowena and the others gathered on the home's ground to watch on, laughing at the young men's antics. But little did Rowena know, her world was about to be smashed apart. The Holston River is well known for dangerous currents and eddies, and not even a wedding day would cause the river to be forgiving. Somehow, the boat capsized, dumping all those aboard into the frigid mountain waters. Everyone on shore watched in horror as the men floundered about against the rushing current. 3 of the 4 men made it back to shore. The one that didn't was Rowena's husband-to-be. He never surfaced again. In fact, no body was ever found. Rowena Ross being heartbroken is an understatement at best. She fell into a deep depression. she became a recluse, never leaving her third-floor room. It's said that she remained at her window, staring out over the river that had taken her one true love. She stayed in this state for the next 2 years before gradually returning to life around her. Eventually, a new man would enter her life and slowly bring love back to Rowena's heart. The two eventually married, but tragedy struck again when the man died of yellow fever not long after their union. Again, Rowena fell into a state of deep depression, this time for more than a decade. Fate would finally give Rowena Ross a glimpse of happiness, though. She eventually married a third time, and this time was even blessed with a daughter of her own. For 6 years, Rowena knew love and happiness, as well as someone could with that sort of past. But as you can guess, things were never quite as they should be. During a vacation back to Rotherwood to visit family, Rowena stunned everyone on hand by saying she saw the ghost of her first love calling to her from the dark waters of the Holston River. That night, while everyone was asleep, she slipped into her original wedding gown, followed the trail to the shore of the river, and calmly waded out into the water. She kept walking until she vanished beneath the surface, never to be seen again. Most people say it was the dress itself that caused her to sink, the heavy fabrics of the time frame becoming too heavy with water to allow Rowena to swim. I think she probably knew this, though. It seems to have been her plan all along. Today, there are countless reports of Rowena's ghost, what locals now refer to as the White Lady. The spirit is said to haunt the grounds of Rotherwood Mansion, especially the riverbank on the property, supposedly still looking for her drowned love. Even many prominent residents of Kingsport have said to have seen her. Now, I know what you're thinking. This one's a little generic and tame for this channel, right? Well, remember, I said we have a 2-for-1 deal today, and I've saved the dark one for last. Let's jump back right to after Rowena Ross's death. Rowena's father, Frederick Ross, never recuperated from his daughter's death. He was plagued with bad business decisions ever since, ultimately causing the family to lose ownership of Rotherwood Mansion. Frederick Ross was a slave owner, having both black and white slaves, but was not known to be a cruel owner. He was said to treat his slaves well. As well as you can be treated and still be a slave, I guess. Anyway, they say Ross never engaged in cruelty. The same could not be said for the overseer and bookkeeper under Mr. Ross's employment, though, a man named Joshua Phipps. Overall, though, Mr. Ross was able to keep Joshua Phipps in check for the most part. But when worse came to worse and the Ross family knew that they would lose their home, Frederick Ross sold the plantation to the only person he knew that could afford it and understand the losses that the land had taken. The same Joshua Phipps. Before the sale of the land was complete, though, Mr. Ross freed as many of the slaves as he could. I never could figure out what exactly was meant by the phrase, as many as he could, but a large portion of the slaves were set free. Many settled in Hawkins County, and they respected their former owner enough that some even took his surname. Legend has it that one such family later gave us the future singer and actress Diana Ross. At the end of it all, though, Joshua Phipps became the owner of Rotherwood Mansion and those slaves that remained. For all the good things that could be said about Frederick Ross as a slave owner, It's said that Joshua Phipps was the direct opposite. Rotherwood then began to change. Slave cells were added inside the basement of the mansion, with only dirt walls and dirt floors. There were no windows installed in the cells. The field slaves were forced to house in a single room at night, and the door was removed and replaced with iron bars. There was no glass or other barrier to protect them from the elements. The following is a personal account from a former worker at Rotherwood Mansion, remembering her experience in the 1920s and 30s. I grew up on the 2,500 or more acres of Rotherwood land. My mother, Inez Looney, was the cook, and my father, James Looney, was the chauffeur, the butler, and the mansion's maitre d'. As a child, I had to go into this area, the slave cells, almost every day because food Mother canned was stored in the basement and the laundry facility was also in that area. The stench was embedded into the ground. The darkness and the dampness was something overpowering. One could imagine hearing the moaning, the wailing, the crying of the slaves, their misery and despair. If a slave was maimed, he was shot like an animal because he was of no more use. In the front room of the third floor facing the river was the whipping post. Slaves were shackled to the post to be whipped. The bloodstains are still embedded into the wood floors of that room. During days of heavy moisture, the wood would expand and the bloodstains would show up again. That retelling was from Virgilia Mama Jill Ellis, a wonderful historian and storyteller from Kingsport, Tennessee. We lost Miss Ellis on December 2nd, 2021, but many of her stories and memories can still be found online. Back to the 1800s and Joshua Phipps. It's said that he installed a whipping post in the house because he enjoyed hearing the screams. It's also said that the beatings were so bad that neighboring plantations reported hearing the screams echoing off the mountains, even though the house was set in the middle of thousands of acres. Phipps wasn't alone in his cruel treatment. He had a mistress, a half-black woman, who was said to be just as cruel, if not more so, than Phipps himself. They say Phipps' wife knew about the mistress, but was scared of the duo and powerless to stop them. From an interview of a former slave at Rotherwood, recorded in the Kingsport Times in 1975, a woman named Aunt Vic Phipps recalls just how dark the man was. Aunt Vic was a child before the Civil War, and remembered hiding in ditches when slave traders would come so she didn't get sold away from her mother. It was during these hidings that she would often overhear Phipps state that when he died, he wanted to be buried standing up on top of the hill at Rotherwood so he could always be looking down on the slaves working. It's also said that Phipps' daughter, Priscilla, had fallen in love with a young man, and Phipps hated the man. When the young man got called off to fight in the American Civil War, Phipps arranged for the young man to be murdered in battle. After it was confirmed to have happened, Phipps actually told his daughter what he did and why he did it. Priscilla then died from depression and grief at the age of 20. Not long after that, in the summer of 1861, Joshua Phipps fell sick. He turned feverish and delusional, but doctors couldn't explain what was wrong. Phipps was removed from the mansion and housed in the carriage house in fear that whatever he had might be contagious. A young slave boy was assigned to keep watch over Phipps. For days, Phipps lay half awake with fever and difficulty breathing. One hot afternoon, The boy keeping watch over Phipps was fanning his owner as he was tasked to do, when Phipps suddenly snapped wide awake, the first time in days. Phipps' terrified eyes seemed to focus on a spot high above the young boy. The boy turned to see what had scared his master, only to find a mass of hundreds of flies swarming in a tight group. The mass of flies swarmed down on Phipps, covering his entire face. They crawled up his nose, into his ears, and into his now screaming mouth. The swarm was so thick that it's reported Joshua Phipps suffocated, choking to death on the mass of flies. The young boy was scared out of his mind. He ran to get help and returned with the family and doctor. They found Phipps dead, eyes open and staring up, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. But there wasn't a fly in sight. They were all gone, and all was quiet. Joshua Phipps was so hated and despised in the area that his funeral was more of a social event than the feel of an actual funeral. There were many prominent people of the region there, if for nothing else, just to be seen. What happened next sounds too wild to be true, but is reported by many of the people there, even prominent members of society of that day. The events are even a huge legend in Kingsport today because many residents were able to get the direct accounts of the funeral either first or second hand from actual witnesses. The casket was loaded onto an open carriage, pulled by 2 large horses from Rotherwood Mansion, up a hill to the cemetery on the grounds. As the procession up the hill began, the 2 horses started to struggle, like the carriage and single casket was too heavy for them. 2 more horses were attached to the team, and slowly, the carriage began to inch its way up the hill. The carriage was stopped again when a tree that had just fallen across the road from a heavy wind that came out of nowhere blocked the path. At this point, those in attendance had begun to murmur about the evil of Joshua Phipps and God's vengeance. The pastor knew he needed to get the service over with quickly as possible, and had the pallbearers remove the casket from the carriage and carry it the rest of the way to the cemetery. Interestingly enough, they did this with no issue, even though 4 horses had struggled with pulling it just moments earlier. The casket was set next to the grave, and the pastor began giving his final words, but movement grabbed everyone's attention. The casket, covered by dark cloth, had started to move, as if something on the inside wanted out, and in a hurry. The gathered crowd heard the sounds of clawing at the inside of the casket. Then the lid burst open. A giant snarling black dog jumped from the casket and bolted off into the woods. The attendants of the funeral were terrified, but a few brave souls inched closer to inspect the casket. The casket laid undamaged, and the body of Joshua Phipps was still inside. The casket was quickly closed and buried. At that point, everyone was in a hurry to get out of there, and it would appear that the land wanted them gone as well. As the crowd started away from the cemetery, it began to rain. Some would later recount that in the rumble of thunder that day, they could hear the laughter of Joshua Phipps himself. In the following weeks, the remaining family at Rotherwood Mansion started to whisper. Things moving in the shadows, hearing animals' feet running through the halls, and the laughter of Joshua Phipps around the home. Some said he would appear at the foot of beds at night and rip the blankets off, keeping everyone from sleeping. It wasn't just the family reporting these things. The slaves were coming to the house on the verge of an uprising, saying Joshua Phipps had risen from the grave and was tormenting them, along with a big black dog at night. The newly hired overseer had to put everyone's worries at rest. With the permission of the family, the new overseer had the grave dug up to show that Phipps was truly dead. The casket was dug up and hoisted from the ground, still sealed. But when it was opened, it was empty. Completely empty, except for what is said to be a few black animal hairs. Before that, the dirt covering the grave had not been disturbed at all. Everything was as it should be. The nightly attacks continued, culminating with the slaves revolting. They destroyed Phipps' headstone and attacked Phipps' former mistress. It's said that they beat her to death, but what happened to the body afterwards is not known. Rotherwood Mansion passed through many owners after that, and is still privately owned today. During the latest renovations, wiring and plumbing were being repaired in the basement where the former slave cells were located. The owner and a friend heard a scream from the basement, then saw one of the workers run from the house, jump in his van, and tear out of the driveway. He had left all of his tools and his partner behind. Later in the day, the worker had calmed enough to say what had happened. He said, while he was working, he had the feeling that someone was watching him. He looked up to find a man in a dark suit step from inside the wall, a large black dog following behind him. The man in the suit gave him a sadistic-type smile and pointed at him. The dog immediately leapt at the worker and chased him from the house. This is just one of many accounts that come from the property. Rowena Ross and Joshua Phipps are the most commonly seen ghosts. They say Rowena Ross means no harm. Joshua Phipps, not so much. There are others as well. Some report seeing Priscilla Phipps, and many spirits of murdered and tormented slaves round out the legend surrounding Rotherwood Mansion. The mansion today is still privately owned, and visitors are turned away and not allowed on the grounds. You know, maybe that's for the best.